Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO at Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. This is one of our episodes for the organizational thought leader. So this is a little bit different than what we normally do. We're doing a series of these as a result of our starting to get an understanding of what companies and organizations are doing with thought leadership. So that sort of disclaimer, I'd like to welcome Polly Mitchell-Guthrie. Polly is the VP of Industry Outreach and Thought Leadership at Kinaxis, the leader in empowering people to make confident supply chain decisions. Previously, she served in roles as Director of Analytic Consulting Services at the University of North Carolina Healthcare System, Senior Manager of the Advanced Analytics Customer Liaison Group in SAS Research and Development Division, and Director of the SAS Global Academic Program. She has an MBA from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a BA in political science as a Moorhead Scholar, and many other accomplishments, but I'd rather get right into it and just chat. So how are you today, Polly?
I'm doing well, all things considered. Hope the same for you.
Great. So in your role at Kinaxis, which is a technology company focused on supply chain, and by the way, thank you, supply chain, an underappreciated part of our universe that is very much appreciated these days. So let me start by asking let's just start baselining here. So what is your or the organization's definition of thought leadership?
So our definition of thought leadership, we've thought about this a lot, but our definition is that thought leadership is all about earning trust through credible, standalone content that speaks peer-to-peer. And so what I mean by that is trust is all clearly about saying we're not just trying to sell a product, although of course at the end of the day we are a software company. We are in the business of generating revenue that way, but we want to show that we're credible. We have a vision, we have innovation. We want to share that with the world. We have a position, we have a value proposition about the unique ways we address supply chain. We also want it to be standalone content. And what I mean by that is, as an example, I'm part of the Office of Strategy, Chief Strategy Officer. Several years ago, read a white paper from another company on a foundational topic in supply chain that became the foundation for her of her understanding of that topic. She didn't end up buying that product. She bought other things from the company, so it enhanced her trust in that company. But when I say standalone, I mean that for her, it was valuable to read that white paper because it explained the concept, even though she didn't end up buying the product. And then the speaking peer-to-peer, for us, that's a critical part. It's all about the fact that we want to illustrate that we have empathy with our customers. We are practitioners in thought leadership who have walked a mile in the shoes of other practitioners, meaning we are people who have led analytics teams, led supply chain teams, and we know what it's like we've been in their shoes.
Got it. So I want to unpack the trust piece because that's fascinating to me, because I don't say that people don't trust companies, but marketing, we all know, has a function. Marketing's function is to support sales, and sales' function is to sell things, right? So anything that typically comes out of a marketing function, be that in the B2B world, be that in the B2C world, the recipients of that have to take it with, I don't want to say a grain of salt, but a level of skepticism, meaning that there's some underlying agenda, right? Jaguar doesn't tell me how great of a car they have so that I can go buy a BMW, right? There's a motive. I think the trust piece is really interesting. If you're putting out pure, unadulterated content, and I love the peer-to-peer piece, you become the trusted advisor, which is the ultimate place for any individual organization to be with their clients. And by not selling, I would argue that you probably sell more. So in the case of your colleague that learned something from that white paper, bought other things, but has a tremendous amount of trust for that organization, it would be interesting to sort of measure backwards to say, as a result of the amazing thought leadership that company put out, did she wind up being responsible for $1 million worth of purchases a year later, 3 years later, 5 years later?
So trust for us, credibility, it's all about the fact that, and in fact, we're not part of marketing. My team is part of the Office of Strategy, which reports directly to the CEO. So we're not marketing, we're not sales, we're not any other function. And
so can I pause you there for a minute? Because the fact that you've got a moat around you, that you're sitting in the strategy side, most folks on the professional side of thought leadership at the organizational level tend to sit in product, tend to sit in marketing. And not that that's bad, but does that take some of the pressure off of you, being that you're on the strategy side of the house and you don't have to deal sort of with the marketing stuff?
I mean, the way I'd put it is that in our mind, strategy is thought leadership is ultimately part of strategy, in that what's our long-term view of where we're going as an organization?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not what are we selling today, what are we building today, what's on our immediate roadmap. It's about what are the, sometimes my informal definition when I've been hiring is to say
Mm-hmm.
that I want to hire people who like to think and write and speak about the business issues driving supply chain. So that's what's happening today, what's happening
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow, what's happening in the future, and how does that inform our strategy? And also for us, an important thing about thought leadership is it's bi-directional. So we
Mm-hmm.
have ideas we want to put out there, and we're trying to certainly influence the way the topic is viewed, but we also want to hear. So we talk to customers and prospects and analysts and other thought leaders because we want to hear back the reaction to our ideas. So it needs to be engaged with the ideas and not just we know all, because we
Sure.
certainly don't. And I guess another thing I'd say right now about that trust factor is that for us, it's also rooted in a sense of responsibility. And,
Mm-hmm.
and now more than ever, as you point out, supply chain is making headlines in ways that your average consumer has not ever thought about supply chain.
Yeah, we never appreciated you when there was always toilet paper on the shelves, right?
That's
We
right. But
never had
people
to
think
think
about
about
it
it.
now, and people
Seriously.
understand
Yeah,
the
yeah,
value of it to all of
yeah.
us. And so part of the responsibility we feel in general is that, for example, in these days, we have to think about what is the supply chain of the future going to look like? How is it
Mm-hmm.
going to change? We all know that
Mm-hmm.
sole sourcing from China it
Has
shows a
risks.
vulnerability
Yeah,
in supply
yeah,
chain. So there are
yeah.
risks in that. Some of the fundamental things about companies like Amazon
Mm-hmm.
that have given us high expectations about getting things to us immediately, that's had supply chains have been built around those expectations. So I don't want to take us down a supply chain path,
Sure.
but my point is that our role is to think about what's that going to look like differently in the future, and how do we help not only our customers, our prospects, but the broader ecosystem. That
Yep.
responsibility to
Yep.
say we want to think for the world at large, in a sense, about what's our contribution to the thinking about supply chains and how they
Mm-hmm.
can function. And so thought leadership is about building trust in the sense that we're trying to be part of and contribute to a conversation around
No,
these
so
things, not
I
just
want
sell
to,
software.
yeah. So I want to touch on the under the theme of trust. You mentioned this bi-directional piece, which means that
Hmm.
you're not just putting work out into the universe, but you're talking to all these other constituents. And I
That's right.
think that in and of itself would build trust, because if all I heard from company X is SVP of company X wrote an article, SVP of company X is speaking, okay, that may build trust. But when you are curating and putting together a plethora of thought leadership, and not every quote or not every contributor is getting their paycheck from the organization, that's interesting, right? So it
Absolutely.
increasing the probability that the receiver is going to go, wow, this is closer to journalism, right, than it is marketing, which is really the goal.
Right. So one other way I've been thinking about this is based on an article or a book I read by a Harvard Business School professor, Ron Heifetz, many years ago, where he talked about the concept of the balcony and the dance floor as a
Mm-hmm.
mode for leadership. And this is certainly also how we think about thought leadership. So the people, especially today, the people running supply chains are running full bore trying to figure out how do they just keep their supply chains
Yep.
alive right now, given
Yep.
the sourcing and challenges issues. When you're right there down there on the dance floor, it can be harder to have perspective. And so customers and prospects on the market look to us to say, you spend all your day talking to all kinds of different companies, you learn from them, help us learn from what you have learned. And so
Right.
that's where the conversation comes in. We have the benefit of being able to be on the balcony. As I said, we go down to the dance floor by talking to people, and we've been
Yep.
practitioners, we know what it's like ourselves. But being on that balcony gives us a chance to have that broader view, to let us synthesize what we've learned, contextualize it, and
Mm-hmm.
share those learnings back. So it always has to be bi-directional. We can't stay on the balcony. We have to go
Yep.
back and forth between the balcony and the dance floor. But that's where it's both a conversation with individuals and companies on the market, as well as a thought process of
Mm-hmm.
synthesizing what we've learned.
Got it. If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So in your world, in your role, how do every organization that makes investments in a function has to say, well, that has to serve a purpose and have some sort of ROI.
Mhm.
Some areas that's easy, some it's not. So we've seen over the last 20 plus years the challenges that brand folks and marketing folks and training people and on and on and on everybody has to be more accountable, some to
Hmm.
the click level, right? So we know
Hmm.
customer acquisition cost to the 11th decimal. How do you, with the organization, look at the investments that you make in thought leadership and put some metrics on it, or determine success, or say, yeah, that's a good investment. We should do more of that next year.
Fair question, and I'll tell you our answer is evolving. So
Yep.
this is a new function for us. I've been in the role less than a year. I've just hired my first full-time, and I have other functions in addition to thought
Yep.
leadership, although that is the core of what I do, the biggest part of what I do. But I just hired my first full-time industry thought leader who started last month. So
Oh,
this
okay.
is definitely
This is very
a
new.
newer.
Wet cement. Yeah.
Well, and I've been doing stuff, and our organization's been doing things. And I will say,
Yep.
by the one other thing I want to insert in there is to echo something you said earlier. Is it's not thought leadership for us is not just about what we write and speak and contribute, but engaging with a broader ecosystem of thought leaders. And so I'm
Right.
right now, for example, again being topical, I'm dealing with a number of thought leaders who are experts in areas around enterprise risk management in supply chains, and those are clearly
Hmm.
relevant for the market today. And trying
Sure.
to look at how we can be in conversation with them and elevate those thoughts for the
Yep.
world as part of that responsibility. But back to the measurement piece. So right now we have mainly what I'd call an input metric. We can measure how many pieces of thought leadership we contribute, whether it be that we write or
Okay.
speak or do a thought podcast or bring somebody else to write or speak or do
So
something for us.
it's in essence volume of widgets or something, right? So last quarter we did X number of podcasts, X, whatever the stuff is. So that would be one measurement. And then what about the engagement of the pieces that you're putting out? Is that another metric that you're looking at?
That's what we're looking at. So right now we're
Okay.
still evolving how, for example, our marketing organization uses the content we produce. Do we make it a call to action, classic
Yep.
marketing terms? Do we measure
Yep.
the
Yep.
clicks, that kind of thing? But what I'd say at a higher level that we're looking at is the notion of influence and how would we measure
Mm-hmm.
influence? So clicks is one measure of influence, but
Yep.
here's an example that I thought was interesting to me. So I'm very active. One other key part I see about thought leadership is through social media. For me, the
Mm-hmm.
primary form there is LinkedIn. So I'll
Yep.
post,
Yep.
what LinkedIn would call a microblog almost every day. And it's a mixture of things about supply chain analytics, and machine learning, which is where I have a strong background,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and and then leadership in a time of crisis, things like that. What's interesting to me in terms of, and I follow, of course, the views that I have, and
Sure.
I find it surprisingly unpredictable which things generate higher engagement. But one thing that interested me is I posted something about a tracking trajectory for the pandemic, and
Mm-hmm.
one person, and it was a supply chain person, commented that they appreciated Kinaxis sharing that. And so what was interesting to me is that they attribute it to the company, not to me as a person, even though it was off my personal LinkedIn profile. So that suggested to me that at least that one reader, if not more than one reader, is
Mm-hmm.
seeing
Mm-hmm.
me as someone
The
who's out
voice
there thinking
of, or
about these
the
things as
yeah,
a voice
yeah.
of the company, even though part of my example of trust is that I'd say I try to follow roughly the 411 rule. Four pieces of content are about the business issues I'm writing or paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to, one about the company, and one that's just more fun or quirky or curious. And so
Yep.
I'm not heavily promoting our company every day. That's a minimal part of what I do. I'm trying to talk about the broad issues. How do you lead in a time of crisis? What does disruption mean
Well,
for a supply chain? What's machine learning impact on a supply chain? That
no,
kind
and I like that 411 because it could be for some subset of the folks that are following you, the quirkiness, they might not articulate it, is one of the factors. Why do I follow Paul? Oh, she puts out these really, every now and then there's something that gets me to scratch my head and go, that's interesting. And then, you sort of, maybe have to eat your vegetables to get the dessert sometimes.
right.
But whatever it is, I love that. I mean, I think the point I'm trying to make there is sometimes we think when we're putting out thought leadership on behalf of a company that it's got to be so, I'm in my corporate mode now and it's got to be
Hmm.
dry and it's got to be specific, and you could add a little seasoning to it, you could have a little fun,
That's right.
you could add,
That's
I mean, you don't want to get silly, right? But you
right.
could, who's reading it? Humans are reading it. What do humans
Right.
want? They want to crack a
Right.
smile, they want
Right.
to think
Right.
differently.
But again, back to the influence thing. So what I
Yep.
would say is that the reason I brought up social media is that it's a little more trackable. I can see
Sure.
what generates engagement, what doesn't, where do I get comments, where do I not? And that's something I pay attention to, although I'll be honest and say that I try to put out there stuff that I think is the right stuff to put out there, and some of it gets higher engagement than others. I'm not
Yeah.
oblivious to it, but I'm also not going for clickbait.
Yep. Yep.
But
Yep.
part of what we're looking at is measurement and influence. So right now we've been trying to think about some kind of equivalent to a net promoter score, or how do we
Mm-hmm.
look at
Mm-hmm.
where people are seeing engagement from what we've done or attributing it. Some of the anecdotal evidence I can give is that our sales reps, for example, have told me that they love what I post on LinkedIn, and I find a high reshare rate of the things
Mm-hmm.
I put out there. They find that very helpful for them. I find that, again, like you mentioned this earlier, but I often, if I'm speaking at an event, I may not make a big pitch about the company, but I'm thinking about a conference I was at several months ago where I asked a question in the audience about machine learning and supply
Mm-hmm.
chains. And a couple of people came up to me afterwards, asked me some questions about my question, and then they wanted to have a dialogue about
Mm-hmm.
the impact of machine learning on supply chains. And then that company became a prospect, and then they ended up becoming a customer.
Fantastic.
Now,
Fantastic.
that's just one little piece. It was a whole team effort to make that happen. But
Yeah,
I
of
believe
course.
that
Right.
part of the value was that I wasn't standing up asking a question. And you've seen the people do this at events where they ask a question, but it's really a sales pitch in their question. I was truly just asking a question. People heard that
Sure.
I was from Kinaxis, but it's about trying to say, again, that raising the level of conversation and contributing to the dialogue, the conversation around things
Sure.
like what's the
Yep.
role of machine learning in a supply chain.
Got it. So as we start to wrap, the last area I want to touch on, because I've heard different things, different responses to this sort of thinking, is if someone is out there now in a role like yours, or new in a role like yours, or wanting to create a role like yours from another role that they have, what are the key factors that they need to have at the organizational level in terms of managing expectations, time, resources? Because this is, again, if we compare and contrast to marketing, which is fine, you have an idea for a campaign, you run the campaign, you run the metrics on the campaign and go good, bad, or ugly, or tweak it, fix it, whatever, and then you move on to the next thing. What would you counsel someone thinking about really, getting their organization to make more significant investments in thought leadership in terms of what needs to be in place in order for that to happen?
I think the organization needs to be clear about what their objectives are, and certainly they vary a lot by different organizations. Some organizations I've seen, some people I've talked to who've been in these roles or are interested in these roles, see a
Mm-hmm.
much stronger tie to sales than where we've positioned it, or a stronger tie to
Mm-hmm.
marketing. And those are valid opinions, but the organization, I think, just needs to be clear for themselves about what is the
So
role of the
goals,
function, the
what's
goals,
our expectations?
what's your
Okay.
expectation. Second is I like the notion of the book, Cal, I can't think of his last name, but wrote the book on deep work. And it's all
Mm-hmm.
about thinking about how do we set aside that time for real thinking and processing and not transactional work. So in order to do thought leadership, I think you have to have that time to be able to read what's happening in your particular space, keep up with it. But then, as I said, it has to be bi-directional. So how do you find ways to engage with your space? How do you talk to, in my case, customers, prospects, even sales reps who can tell me what are they hearing back from customers? What are the questions they ask? What do they
So let me
want? So I
play
need to
that
find a
back.
way to have that.
So the precursor to measuring even the quantity of output is giving someone the space to be thoughtful, right? So if part of your role is, you're thinking about something you might create and you got to talk to 10 salespeople and go to a conference and read all these other things, that time has to be allocated, right? So if that's
Right,
whatever that is, 10, 15, 20% of your time, it's
right,
nothing time, right?
right,
it's
right, absolutely. And
okay.
then I think you have to think about consumption. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
things I've heard people say about different vehicles of thought leadership before is, one person told me about another thought leader they encountered. Oh, he always made me feel dumb. I never understood what he was talking about. So I don't think thought leadership has to be use a lot of
Patronizing.
but it also doesn't have to use a lot of big words.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't have to be beyond the realm of your average thinker. It needs to actually be addressing issues. This gets back to the empathy of what
So
are the
get away
real
from the
issues
also
driving people.
the technical jargon and all that sort of stuff. Make it approachable.
Yes, you
Make
have
it
to think about your audience. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
when I'm writing about machine learning or artificial intelligence in supply chain, I'm not dropping words like hyperparameter tuning unless I'm talking to a technical audience. But if I'm talking to my primary audience, which would be business leaders who don't really understand what the stuff is, or maybe they understand it, but it's fuzzy for them and they want to know where it could add value and is there reality there? How do I
Yep.
explain that in ways that is not patronizing, but is also not using big words and jargon? And so trying to find a way to be accessible, but in a style and a voice that makes sense to me. So
Yep. Yep.
you have to find your own voice, and that's certainly a balance. So I would say that's
Mm-hmm.
important for an organization trying to set up a thought leadership function to think about. And then finally, I'd say, what's that balance between how much of it you want to write or contribute yourself versus working with other parties? Do you want to
Hmm.
have individuals, a broad spectrum of individuals within the company contributing? What's that role between where and how much you push the company message versus aligning with the company message, but not sprinkling the company name throughout what you're talking about?
So
What does
sort
that
of
look
that
like?
church and state line, if you will, right?
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. And again, the organizations are going to find different boundaries of where
Sure,
they draw that line,
sure.
but I think you have to get clear on where that line is for you as a company, and
Yep.
then hew to that line.
Fantastic. Well, this has been great. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your journey with us. And it's early-ish, but you've had a lot of success in this area. And I think you're sort of on the cutting edge of how to do this well and effectively and with purpose and with desired outcomes for the organization. So thank you so much for joining us today, Polly.
Glad to. Thank you for the time. I appreciate the invitation.
Thanks. If you enjoyed this episode, and I do hope that you did, please join our new LinkedIn group, which is exclusively focused on the organizational thought leader, the person in the corporate world that is using thought leadership as part of their job, whether that's developing thought leadership, whether that's deploying thought leadership, whether that's helping others do so. Please take a look and check out our LinkedIn group. We think you'd get a lot of benefit from that. Thank you.